This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. This week's shout-out goes to Sarah Beth Grimmer, our newest patron. She's a conversation starter at $5 a month. Thanks, Sarah Beth. And now let's get into the interview. In this episode, I talk with Reverend Kyndall Rothaus about becoming a female pastor in Texas, trusting women, dealing with misogyny, microaggressions, and rape culture. This is part 2 of our conversation, so be sure to listen to the previous episode if you haven't yet. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
You know, the statistics say that this is going to touch you at some point in your life, or it's just a matter of time, right? Because the women in your life likely have dealt with these things in one form or another. And so think about it now so that you're more prepared when it becomes all too real in sort of a bigger way. And then that is something I think that men can do to work on this issue for themselves and in their own lives, you know?
Yeah, and I think part of that is acknowledging that it's already happening. If you're not aware of what's going on in your specific community or context, all that means is that you're not aware.
Yeah. Like you said before, you know, that our responses often can sort of show whether or not we're a safe person to talk to. And so do you have any other advice, since we're on the topic of things that men can do to help for men, that they can, how we can be more safe for people to share and talk to and be a resource rather than more of a someone to be feared or looked out for or worried about?
Yeah, I definitely have advice. I mean, first I want to say, because I'm kind of coming from a church context, I realize not everyone listening is necessarily in that context. But if you're in a leadership position in a church, I think it's really important to be aware that there are absolutely women in your context who are being abused or who have experienced abuse or assault. So, for example, if you're going to preach a sermon about marriage and you're going to lift up marriage as this gift from God, which is fine, don't do that without also including at least a sentence or two about, but for those of you experiencing abuse in your marriage, that is not of God. Like, even if that's all you say, you know, you're just leaving out a little hook, you know, like, so someone can reach out to, like, they know you get it. Because so many of our sermons about marriage and about relationships and about love, they act as if this isn't happening. Right. And so just a simple acknowledgement can go a long ways, I think. And then interpersonally, we've already kind of mentioned this, but just being quiet more often, you know? I mean, you know, I had a friend who in seminary would like keep track in class of how many times, like how much percentage of the conversation was taken up by men in the room versus women.
Yeah.
You know,
Guilty.
and had like this tracker.
I talked so much in seminary, I'm sure.
Yeah. And so just being aware, you know, and that applies to not just to men and women, but any kind of privilege, you know, like if you're a white person, be quiet more often. If you're, you know, and so but I think that listening and then being able to demonstrate that you've heard, you know, so responding to what someone has said rather than either dismissing, ignoring, or reacting to it. So a good practice, I think, is when someone is saying something, particularly like a woman or a marginalized voice, no matter what kind of reaction it's causing in you, before you respond, at least take a deep breath. Like that in and of itself will get you a long ways. You know? Take a deep breath, notice what you're feeling, and then say, okay, how can I respond to what I've heard versus react? And response is different. And it's just sort of those small things we do in conversation that let people know whether you're safe or not. And then the other thing is, if someone in a marginalized group has a criticism of what you've said or done, listen. Listen to, and that doesn't mean they are always going to be right and you're always going to be wrong and you always have to take a posture of, I'm a horrible person who messes everything up. That's not what I'm saying. You know, but what I'm saying is, don't assume that you know more. In fact, you should assume that you know less because you don't know what it's like to live a marginalized existence. And so the assumption should always be, I have something to learn here. And if there's this sort of thing rising up in me that feels defensive, just set it aside. Momentarily. You can come back and journal about it later in the privacy of your own space, but you don't need to spew that into the conversation. Right. You know? So I think practices like that go a long way.
Yeah. And we talk a lot on this podcast about being curious and the way that curiosity sort of changes the atmosphere almost. And I think often it's most difficult to get curious about ourselves because it's the most uncomfortable. But being able to be curious about why you're having reactions or certain feelings and really investigating that and interrogating that a little bit, rather than just starting to react to whatever is happening. Another sort of phrase that I hear a lot that I wonder if people know much about, and I may not know as much about it as well, is this phrase rape culture. And it's very, I love it because it's very frank. It's very like a little bit in your face. And I think that's intentional. And on this podcast, we're always trying to talk about things that we avoid talking about. And so it can be really uncomfortable to hear a phrase like rape culture. But I wondered if you could share what you know about this phrase, what it means. I don't know if you know more about where it came from, but at least from your perspective, what is rape culture?
Yeah, I mean, you're so right that it's an uncomfortable phrase and it sort of elicits a strong response in people. There was a time when, a couple years ago, when I was working with a team of women and we were putting on a series of prayer services for survivors of assault on Baylor's campus, Baylor University. And in one of our litanies that we wrote, we had used the word rape culture, but we were made to take it out. We had to edit it in order to be allowed to say this prayer on Baylor's campus. You know, and it was so fascinating. Well, fascinating in a sort of dark and disturbing way. That at that time, you know, Baylor was kind of in the middle of this big scandal of covering up all these assaults. And it was like, we were more interested in covering up the word rape culture, you
Yeah.
than letting that come to light. And so anyway, for me personally, the power of that phrase is that it helps us understand that rape and assault are not simply isolated events between a rapist and his victim. That there is a culture that we live and breathe that normalizes violence against women, that normalizes that there's some sort of sexy appeal to pursuing a woman even when she said no. There is a culture that normalizes the superiority of men over women, a culture that suppresses women's voices and women's truth. And so it's in a similar way, it's not exactly the same, but a parallel might be, understanding that racism isn't a particular act. It's a system to which we belong. And so a word like rape culture is trying to, I think, create this awareness that rape isn't just what happens between some really bad guy and his poor victim, that we're all participating in this culture that makes rape more possible, and that makes it hard to bring justice, that makes it hard for women to heal, that makes it hard for women to tell their stories. Like, it's all wrapped up together. And so it's not simply a matter of, okay, how do we stop the few men who really are serial rapists, How do we change the whole culture, the whole way we talk about relationship, the whole way we talk about sex, the way we talk about consent, the way we talk about love and intimacy? How do we transform the ways we relate to each other so that rape and assault don't even make sense anymore, you know?
Yeah. It's a little hard to imagine right now, but that does seem, like, if we raise boys to think differently about the world, and especially about women, then you can imagine a very different kind of world that we could live in. And as you were kind of explaining that, it made me think too that these like sort of individual cases that we hear about in the news, like the swimmer from Stanford, Brock Turner, or things like we get bogged down almost in the details or what did or didn't happen on a specific night. And what we don't ask is, how did that guy get to the point where that seemed like an okay decision, whether he was maybe inebriated or whatever? It was in his world of options for things that he could do,
right.
that were almost permissible. And maybe for some men that's a little bit unconscious because we don't examine it and we don't think about it. But asking how does a man get to the point where that is an option? And this has been like, unfortunately, very normal for the history of the world, right? In so many throughout wars and history, raping women has been more the norm than not, and we haven't really had to sit and think about that very hard as men, right?
Right.
Women have had to deal with it and then try to figure out how to survive and how to live their lives, or find ways. There's probably like old stories that I don't know of throughout history of ways that women have gotten revenge because of this culture, right? Even when they didn't have rights or didn't have things, they find ways to take out the frustration of that culture. But it just seems, as you're saying, there's so much more going on besides one specific incident with one individual that we're not talking about. And I think what rape culture, the phrase or the idea, is asking us to think more about how we get to the point where those things happen, and then how all of the ways throughout history up to today that we make it okay.
Yeah, like you think of, I mean, just think of movies you've seen.
Yeah.
And there are so many scenes that in which a woman is clearly saying like, no, like I'm not into you. Romantic comedy, for example.
Right.
You know, where
so many.
the man's sort of insistence, you know, and he kind of finally breaks through, and we just see it as romantic and funny, and you know, it all seems very harmless, but what we really are doing is normalizing this thing in which like a woman doesn't really mean what she says. You don't have to listen to it. If you have feelings for her, you should practically stalk her and it will be really romantic. Like, you know, and we think of those things as like, oh, that's no big deal. It was just a romantic comedy. But when you are sort of inundated with that messaging over and over and over and over again, it's no wonder that men kind of, they can fall into this faulty way of thinking about like what romance is and how to deal with their unrequited love, and you know, and it's confusing for women too, I think.
Right.
That, you know, it's like, well, this guy is it kind of gives me the creeps, but I've been taught to think that this is romantic. So like, how am I supposed to feel? You know, so there are these ways that we just get ourselves all mixed up.
Yeah, I thought of that too when you mentioned pursuing women when they say no, and there's so many movies that have this, but the movie that comes to mind is When Harry Met Sally, which is, I love that movie so much. It's so, you know, it's sort of this like archetype of these romantic comedies. You know, and I love Billy Crystal.
It ruins movies.
It does ruin them a little bit, right? And I love Meg Ryan and the whole, you know, aesthetic of that movie. And there's all these, you know, it's a great little quirky movie. But when you stop to think about the way that Billy Crystal acts and the things that he does, and he continues to pop up in her life, and it's really weird and inappropriate, and he's like, it starts to become a little bit strange. And you're right, like it does affect how we think about our own like romantic life and who we're pursuing, and whether or not we should pursue someone or whatever. We are very influenced by these messages because they're everywhere. I'm sorry if I ruined When Harry Met Sally, but if you start like paying attention to those movies, you're gonna have a lot of them ruined for you, unfortunately. And the other thing that you said was the way that it like begins to create these ambivalent feelings or this kind of confusion for both for men and for women. I think for men, it's like, oh, well, I'm supposed to do this thing. And I think there are a lot of men who feel very weird about that or very uncomfortable and yet still feel like that's what's expected of them or how they should behave, or this is how you find someone to be in a relationship with, right? And we all want connection, and these are the messages we got. And so we're trying to work with what we've been given. And then for women, that, you know, when you were explaining the feeling of like, well, I said no, but he's not taking no for an answer. And well, the movies sort of show that that's romantic, and he's being somehow like, you know, I don't know, chivalrous. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what to call it, but there's that feeling of like, well, that's what men are supposed to do, and maybe I'm supposed to be okay with it. And your poem has all of those feelings as well, related to the harassment of the custodian, or things that aren't rape. They're not sexual assault, but they are, you know, what are called microaggressions. Can you talk a little bit for you how those sorts of things do cause these feelings of like uncertainty and ambivalence or confusion about women's experiences, and then what they're supposed to do about it, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think microaggressions is a great example because, you know, there are these things people say that we just sort of are supposed to brush off as not being consequential, but yet it's like something is chipping away, at your self-confidence day after day after day, and I know one thing I experience a lot is people making comments about my age and my voice, because not only am I a woman, I'm a woman with a small voice, and I have a very small stature, and I look really young. I frequently get mistaken. I'm 34. I get mistaken for a teenager quite often. And there are people who make comments and they mean nothing by it, but there are also people, I remember very distinctly being at a community event when I was a pastor in San Antonio, and one of my congregants introduced me to someone else in the community, and they were very proud to say, and this is our pastor, Kyndall. And the person looked right at me. And this was a woman. She looked me right up and she looked me up and down, and she goes, "She looks 12." And it was so condescending.
Oh wow!
And I don't know why, but people always choose 12. I don't know why it's 12. I'm like, I haven't been 12 in a couple of decades, but but it's and it's some people like her meant it very sort of like, I want to cut you down, and some people just say, oh, you're so cute, you look 12,
right?
And it, like you look like my granddaughter or whatever, and they don't necessarily intend it in the same way, but when you hear those kind of comments day after day after day, you're like, well, gosh, like maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe maybe I should have went to school longer. Maybe I'm not really, maybe I don't have enough life experience. And so that's just an example of how these small little things we say start to eat at someone's confidence. But it also is a way to be dismissive without being outright rude. So I can't tell you how many times people, talk about me being cute versus being competent, in the job I'm doing. And so they can seem harmless, but there are these ways we discredit the validity of the work women are doing in the world.
Yeah.
And I think it creates this ambivalence about our own selves, like, well, am I legit? And it creates this ambivalence about the way we view each other, like the way women view other women, even. So I lost my train of thought there, but I think it's so important to identify microaggressions as a part of that rape culture and that patriarchal culture that we were talking about. Because it's really easy to dismiss those things, as those microaggressions, as not a big deal. But it's kind of a death by paper cuts kind of metaphor. They add up.
Yeah. I think it's also helpful maybe to think about microaggressions as creating permission for certain things, right?
Yes.
So because this is allowed, right, then other things also become allowed. And it's really that the question from earlier about what makes it possible for Brock Turner to decide that it's okay when someone's passed out to rape them, that I might feel like I can't imagine that, right? For myself in my own life, but something made it possible for that to happen, right? And it's not just that Brock Turner is evil. He did something evil, but there's a lot of things that make it possible for evil to happen. And it's not just because of bad people. And that's where, again, we're getting a little bit back to theology, but we tend to think about bad people doing bad things and not the fact that really well-meaning and well-intentioned people create spaces and permission for bad things to happen through things like microaggressions, because it means that we're all implicated, right? It means that we all have to do more work to highlight those things and say, hey, that's actually not okay, because it demeans people, or it puts them down, or it's belittling, or any of those things, and to speak up for people when those things happen, especially as we're speaking about, so gender disparities, like as men who have a lot more privilege to speak up for when that happens, and when you see that happening to women. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I also, because I know you primarily through preaching and spoken word, poetry, things like that. I do also think about your voice. Yeah. And I even thought about talking about it. So I'm really glad you brought it up. For me, what is really powerful to me is that you do have this softer presence and this sort of like quieter demeanor. And yet when you preach, you say these powerful things. And for me personally, that is so powerful to me, to have someone soft-spoken and sort of almost, in some ways, I really don't want to contribute to belittling or putting you down in any way, but someone who is maybe has some stereotypical, like, of those feminine features of being soft-spoken or being sort of quiet, but then to say some of the things that I have heard you say in a pulpit is so powerful. And I don't know if it's more powerful for women to hear that from someone with your voice, but to me, it feels really like incredibly powerful. So I hope that's more encouraging than demeaning or belittling.
Yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, I definitely experience both. Like there is this, there's this gift to being soft-spoken and a female voice that, I mean, it's interesting how it sometimes just commands attention. Almost like people are leaning in to hear. Yeah. And they're not used to someone with my kind of voice speaking the kind of truth I'm speaking.
Which is probably why the man that you called who hadn't attended church felt pretty uncomfortable and didn't want to come back.
Yeah, so there's I think it's sort of a double-edged sword in that I've certainly experienced people who find it kind of arresting, like they are captivated by it, and I think it makes what I have to say like more powerful. And then on the flip side, there are people who like someone once said I think it was let me think. Oh yeah, I had just done a funeral. So at a funeral you have people who aren't used to, they come from all over and they're not used to you as their pastor. Right. Someone's response was that was a really good service, but I don't think I could get used to her voice. So I also have people who respond very negatively to it. They're very used to a certain kind of presence in the pulpit and a certain tone, in a certain pitch. Like a lot of people can't, or they say, "Oh, I couldn't hear you." Like they literally can't hear what I'm saying. So it's a double-edged sword, I think.
I can't really imagine. Maybe someone has said it, or maybe there's a male pastor that has just such a grating voice that someone would say that about them. But I really can't imagine anyone saying that about any male pastor or preacher, that their voice is what was going to cause them to not be able to go to a church or something. That's right. Interesting. Yeah. I get comments about my voice all the time, positive and negative. Yeah. Well, and it's important for people to those small things. That's what we're talking about with microaggressions. Is those are little things that we assume, men primarily assume, are not a big deal, or they're kind of innocuous. They're not, or even that they're saying something like the custodian, right? Like maybe people think they're saying something that someone should be flattered by, right?
Right,
Those
yeah.
are the things that we need to interrogate and say, well, why would you think that? Or what does it mean that you think that, especially if you're challenged with it making other people uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kyndall, I feel like we could go another hour, and I would love to have you back to talk more about these things. We touched briefly on trauma, and I do want to do an entire episode on trauma because it's something we don't know very much about. And when we're engaging with other people, especially around things that are difficult, I think we're not very aware about the way that trauma plays into those conversations, because we don't talk about it.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a whole issue that I want to have an entire episode on in the future. And I just want to acknowledge it because I haven't done an episode yet. And I'm aware and want to go deeper into that topic. You're working on a second book right now, which fits in with what we've been talking about. And so I wanted to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about it and when we can expect that to be out in the world.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this book. I've really only just started it, but it's the title is "Thy Queendom Come," and it will be published by Broadleaf Press, and it won't be out until 2021. But I'm looking at this idea of the kingdom of God through a feminist lens. And and actually I tell a lot of my story in the book about my experiences with sexism in the church and the way I think it's so important that we reimagine our theology to be sort of free of that patriarchal lens. So anyway, that's one of the projects I'm working on now, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I'm excited for it to come out and to read more from you. So I like to wrap up the podcast with two things: going out and going deeper. So I like to leave people with some action steps going out that they can do. And then going deeper, a resource, recommendations that we might have for people to go deeper. And I can go first to give you a little time to think about it. An action step, I think, pulling from our conversation just now, it came up several times. And it's also, again, even though I know this in my own life, it's a good reminder for me. But being quiet. And listening well. Those are skills that we don't always. Some people are naturally good listeners and may be good at it, but there's a whole lot of us and a whole lot of men who aren't good at listening and have been trained in many ways not to listen. And so I want to recommend an action step. I guess this is most specifically aimed at the men of listening and being quiet. And in that silence, interrogating our feelings and our emotions. There's a lot going on there. And men are just as complex human beings as women, right? And if we have any hope of getting better at these issues and working towards better, healthier ways to live together, that's the work that men really need to do, is interrogate those responses, reactions that we have and feelings when we are quiet and we listen to what's going on inside of us. Going deeper, boy, I feel like there's so many resources to recommend to people. I'll certainly recommend reading your first book, Preacher's Breath, or Preacher Breath, that people can find now. I'll include in the show notes some links to statistics on sexual violence. We mentioned that early on in the conversation, and I want to make sure people understand that it's not something, I think, that we're pulling out of thin air, that these things are happening, and there's a lot of data that supports what you and I have been saying in this conversation. Maybe two other resources. I'll recommend 2 episodes that I've done on this podcast. The first one was with Matthias Roberts, who has a book that came out this year in 2020 called Beyond Shame. And I read it, and it was a fantastic resource for me trying to really think about shame and the way it functions in my own life as I'm thinking about the ways that these things operate in men as well, and they drive us in many ways that we are not aware of. So that conversation is a great resource for interrogating those things. And then I also did an episode with Julie Jeske, who's a sex therapist, called All About Sex. She's fantastic, and we talked very frankly about a lot of things I, as a man, grew up with, and the ways that those things drive me, and trying to figure out and unravel and unpack how I can be healthier as a man with my own sexuality. And I think those are really important things as we've been talking about this culture, rape culture, and culture of patriarchy. Those are the going deeper things that men need to do to unravel in their own life and try and notice these things that are happening that we've been talking about. And so I would recommend those 2 episodes, and I'll put those in show notes as well. Kyndall, what are your 2 things, going out and going deeper?
Going out, what came to mind first for me was our responsibility to help center and elevate women's voices, and the voices of other marginalized groups. And so I think whatever your context is, like if you're a pastor, make sure you're having women's voices in your pulpit. If you're a professor, make sure women's voices are a part of your curriculum. If you're a big reader, make sure that you're reading women's voices. So whatever your context is, whether that's professionally or just sort of where you invest your time and energy, not just relying on the men's voices, but making sure that you're including other voices both in your learning and in your teaching is, I think, such a big, important step that we all need to be taking.
Yeah.
Make sure you're listening to women of color. So there's so many things you can do. But in terms of one concrete thing that just came up for me as important.
Yeah.
And then in terms of going deeper, again, there's so much I could point to. One thing I want to point out is simply that I would encourage people to follow Nevertheless She Preached, which is the movement and conference that my friend, the Reverend Natalie Webb, and I started. And our whole goal is to center and elevate the voices of women on the margins. So we have an annual conference, and then like our social media page frequently highlights women who are doing important work in the world.
Yeah.
And we've had some men come to our conference, which has been amazing, but I would love to see lots of men, because I think it's so powerful to come be in an environment in which women hold the stage. It's just a different environment.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of important things to learn from that.
Yeah, most definitely. I can remember when I was in undergrad, I think I may have shared this story before, the first time that I went to a black church with my friend Kim, and the feeling of being the minority in the room. Yeah. And it's a similar feeling, I think, for a lot of men, but it's good for us to experience, to go and again, as I said, listen and learn, and be in a position of just learning and paying attention, observing. and not needing the stage, not needing to be noticed, not needing to be heard, or it can be hard. I know for myself and for many men I see in those situations sometimes the need, like there's just this pull that in order to be important we have to almost like put ourselves in the middle and find ways to make ourselves important. And so, go to this conference. The women that you have there preaching and speaking are incredible, fantastic. I'm amazed. I follow a lot of them on social media, and it's just so good. So many voices that you miss out on if you don't go to something like this. If you just kind of keep chugging along on the status quo where you're at, you're gonna get the status quo, which is unfortunately mostly white male voices still.
Right.
So put in a little effort and go to something like Nevertheless She Preached, and you're gonna get way more than you bargained for. So I heartily endorse the conference that you guys have put together. It's really fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks.
Kyndall, thanks so much. Is there anything else before I go? I'm going to include links to Preacher Breath, Nevertheless She Preached, and your website. Anything else you want me to plug, or places people can find you online?
They can also find me on Instagram at Kyndall Rothaus, and also Facebook.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been great, and you've been very generous with your time. This will probably end up being a 2-part episode, which is great because the topic definitely deserves 2 parts. So thank you so much for spending your time speaking to us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Hope Fellowship Mennonite Church for their generous support of the podcast. Also, many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.